Who should produce the food we eat in a society? If we apply the ownership principles we talked about from a previous video, it comes out with a rather interesting answer. This is an interesting sector to examine as it really tests the 5 principles. There's a whole video about these principles, but very briefly, the 5 principles to determine whether a sector should be privately or publicly owned are the following. The first principle is whether or not the sector forms a natural monopoly. If it does, this favors public ownership. If it doesn't, it favors private ownership. The second principle is physical survival. If a good or service produced by a sector is needed for physical survival, then it favors public ownership. If it doesn't, then private. The third principle is percentage of the population, and the higher the percentage, the greater the argument in favor of public ownership. The fourth principle is inequity risk. This is where if private ownership increases the odds of inequity in society, then this favors public ownership. The fifth principle is non-economic benefits. This one says that if a sector produces goods or services that have non-economic benefits, then this favors public ownership. Now let's apply those 5 principles to the food sector. When we're talking about the food sector, it covers everything from agriculture and growing produce all the way to selling it in grocery stores. So it's a very large definition of the food sector because it covers where do we get our food from, who makes our food. This is much broader than most economists would think, but I'm not an economist, so that's what you're going to get. We are just trying to conceptually apply some principles to things that we need in society, and food is something a society needs. So let's work through the principles we just summarized. Again, I encourage everyone to go watch the full video about those principles because it's much more detailed. First of all, everyone needs food for physical survival, obviously. So this makes it in favor of public ownership on that principle. But unlike things like specific medical treatments that don't have a substitute, or drinking water that can't be replaced with something else because ultimately everything that you need to drink is water, even if it's flavored somehow. Food is a little bit different than drinking water because many different types of food can provide the same benefit, whereas there's only one type of water. These different foods can substitute for one another, so this makes the sector as a whole less prone to be called a natural monopoly. So on the natural monopoly principle, the food sector doesn't really lend itself to being a natural monopoly. It's much more competitive because anyone with fertile land can start producing some food. Farmers can switch to growing whatever the most profitable crops might be, and people can change the foods that they eat if certain types become too expensive. From this perspective, food is quite a competitive sector. Of course, large firms can buy each other out to become oligopolies and monopolies. On the inequity principle, there are inequity risks. For example, if the concentration of ownership in a particular subsector within food, whether it's agriculture or logistic transportation or grocery store retail, if concentration gets too large in one of those subsectors of food production, then the prices can get too high for some people. If ownership concentration gets too high or subsectors become locally monopolized, then there are risks on the inequity principle. For example, if all your food is grown by one company, or all your food is distributed by one company, or all your food is sold to you by one company. The inequity risk is that if competition is insufficient and prices become very high, this excludes the poor from being able to meet their basic nutritional requirements. So according to the inequity, there is an argument in favor of public ownership. Next, if we look at the non-economic benefits principle, clearly there are substantial non-economic benefits from having access to food, as in being alive. Having enough food for growing as a person, having enough food to feed your children. And so there are substantial non-economic benefits which favors public ownership. But if we take a step back and consider the possibility of what a publicly owned food sector would look like, it would probably result in a lack of choice that many people would not like. Food production is relatively competitive, and because specific types of food can be easily substituted for other kinds of food, it's hard to say that there's a monopoly as long as one company or a very few number of companies don't buy up the entire sector. This, of course, is a risk. So the food sector could probably be controlled by a mix of private and cooperative enterprises, but only if antitrust laws are enforced to ensure that competition stays robust. Another approach to avoiding market failures is to have publicly owned firms operating alongside private and cooperative firms within the sector. This would help control prices from getting out of hand and would enable providing key food staples at reasonable prices for everyone. So I think the food sector is a good one for a mix of all types of ownership. It's not common that we see a food sector with a high level of public ownership, and most food sectors seem to work quite well. So the argument in favor of public ownership is quite weak in the food sector. I think most countries get by quite well with a fully privately owned or cooperatively owned set of enterprises in the mix. But it's very important that competition is maintained within the sector because food overall is needed as a basic necessity. If food becomes too expensive because there's a major lack of competition in any of the subsectors within food production, this is very problematic for society and can be quite destabilizing. So while we might have a fully privately and cooperatively owned food sector, it does have to be regulated quite tightly because of its importance to society.